Hey, good morning, all. Glad to have you along with us today. It's Wednesday, June 9th, and the Good Podcast coming to you from Washington, D.C., where I find myself today in our nation's capital, and from Chicago, Illinois, and from Atlanta, Georgia, and being produced from South Bend, Indiana. So we have much of the country covered in our conversation where we're coming from today. I'm Doug Pagitt, joined with Dominique Gilliard and Stephany Spaulding. Laura Truax is away today. Dan Dietrich back into the of our production here. So glad to have all of you aboard. Let us know in the chat where you're coming from and where you find yourself on this fine day. I'll say I am in Washington, D.C. because I'm going to be part of an event today that's launching a 4-week fast for freedom built around asking people of faith and conscience to fast. Maybe it's not for 4 weeks. That's a long time. Maybe it's just for a day or for a week, but joining with people who will be fasting over 4 weeks. And the freedom that's being talked about is the freedom, especially for workers and other immigrants in our society who are living under our system that does not acknowledge their legal spaces and places in our society. So it's calling for Congress to fix this broken immigration system and the broken immigration laws that we have. A group called Faith in Action is one of the key organizers for this. They're putting together an event today that I'm going to be part of. So if you're watching on this live stream here, you likely will see some material coming from and video coming from those meetings that are going to be held today, commissioning the first group of people to begin this fast. So get on the Vote Common Good email list, which you can do over at votecommongood.com if you want to find out more about how you can be part of all of this. So that's what brings me to Washington, D.C., and then also being in some conversations with other partners here on some of the projects that we're working on. So that's why I find myself here. Good morning to you, Stephany, and you find yourself in Chicago in your new home on this day. Is that right?
Good morning, Doug. Good morning, everyone. Dominique, yes, I am in Chicago, loving the weather that is a treat to my skin. It's humid and so different from Colorado's arid desert climate, where the dryness did wonders as well in a different way. So it's a good Wednesday morning. We're glad to be here with you all in this faithful space and having conversations as we look at how faith impacts the things that are broken or fixable or just abound around us. So happy to be in conversation this morning and going to turn it over to our colleague and co-host, Dominique.
Hey, Dominique Gilliard, Director of Racial Righteousness and Reconciliation for the Evangelical Covenant Church, coming to you from right outside of Atlanta. And yeah, just embracing the summer and all the summer brings, the new rhythms, and the heat and all that good stuff, and excited to talk today about an issue that the church doesn't talk enough about in consumption and how it informs how we relate and see our neighbor, but also what it means for us to ethically bear witness to who and whose we are through how we consume. Excited to press into this today, Doug.
Yeah, this issue of living in a consumer culture, and I don't say that yet with a sense of derision or with negativity around it, that we live in a consumer culture. We just do. It's just the fact that our economy is actually built on the purchase of products. It's built on services rendered. It's built on people exchanging goods and services for income. That's how we're organized as a society. Capitalism is the method by which we operate in this society to move goods and services to one another. And that's just one of the ways human beings could be organized, right? It's the way that's very common to all of us. If you're alive today, your entire life has been inside of a consumer-based culture and society. It's not the only way that a civilization could be organized. There's other ways that you could move money, and that you could move property, and that you could organize your life together. But in our world, we live in a consumer-based economic and cultural system that people ask one another, what do you do for work? What products do you buy? We brand ourselves by the products that we utilize. It's just built into our culture and our society. And so we want to talk a bit about that and the influence that has, because it's not a human demand, because it's not something that's just simply the way the world is for human beings. It's a social construct. And because it's a social construct, it is riddled with all the other implications of social constructs. And it's something that I think all people, but especially those of us who think about how we can live well with ourselves and with one another, we have to consider these things. We have to think about that, because it's not neutral and it's not just a given, and it has a cultural demand on it. We have to be attentive to it. It's something we need to care for in our own lives. And I have a particular kind of concern about the issue of consumerism, and that is it can turn everything into a product or a service to be consumed for our goods, including our relationships with one another, including our relationships with ourselves. Like, we might think about our own lives and our own friendships and the people that we interact with simply through the lens of, what is this going to give to me? What is this going to produce for me? What's the outcome of this going to be? What's the result of this? I mean, we could ruin it by thinking about whether our weekend was used appropriately or not, right? Were we effective enough? Were we restful enough? Or did we work hard enough? Did we get enough done in our chores? We can just continue to look at our entire lives through the lens of, what is this producing? What is its outcome? And that's a kind of lack of attentiveness to the things that make life, and to make love, and to make the common good. And so how does it compete? So this is kind of a big issue that can move to, like, hey, do we really need to buy as much as we're buying? Do we really need to relate to one another and to our products and the things in our world in the way that we do? So Stephany, Dominique, how are you? How have you approached this issue before? How are you thinking about it? What rolls around in your lives as you're thinking about these things?
I think for me, immediately when we were constructing what we would talk about today, and even now with your introduction, Doug, the idea first comes to mind that most people, especially in the United States, have no concept of society being organized any other way. It is such a foreign concept to think that goods and means of exchange is just not like natural or normal, and there will be so much pushback or just consternation if you ask people to think of a different way in which society could be organized, right? What could another model look like? And not just like a transfer or a barter system, because again, that's still like, consumption, but what could society look like without being, this consumerist, capitalist based society? It would be so hard for people to construct. I've done this with students, and for them, it just seems like this is the natural order of things. But yeah. I introduce this because when I am teaching, I teach the civilizing of the American Indian, right? And I'm using that language specifically because that is the language that was used in specific texts. There are books that are titled in that way, and one of the major issues around colonizing the United States, where they literally had to have conferences, like, my students joke, and there's like, well, nobody sitting in a room, thinking about like, what do we do to take over the world, Pinky and the Brain? There actually were white men sitting in rooms thinking about well, how do we take over this place, this land? And one of the things that they had to do was really Americanize or Westernize, train indigenous people to think of a worldview in which possession is possible, that people own and possess the land. That was not conceivable for indigenous people. That one would own property was unconceivable. It was as if you were trying to teach somebody that the earth is round as opposed to flat. And they literally had to do the work in order to Americanize them. And so when I think about us being a consumerist capitalist nation, I reflect on that history and that level of indoctrination in order to get us to this place, right? To get us to this place that consumerism is so ingrained in who we understand ourselves to be that we can't even imagine otherwise.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And then I think on top of that, one, that there was this thorough attempt to indoctrinate, but then also this resistance within indigenous communities to still not conform to that logic and that way of thinking. Yeah. And so oftentimes when we try to get out of this box or think out of this box, we go to our indigenous sisters and brothers and say like, hey, help us to see why this is ultimately bankrupt, why this is not a sustainable way of engaging the world and seeing our neighbor and the way that we are related to creation. So it's funny that even the initial folks who were dedicated to really be indoctrinated are the ones who have actually resisted it the strongest and the one we still rely upon as we try to get ourselves out of that box. But then I even connect what you were saying, Stephany, to Dr. Willie Jennings' work, where he talks about both. He talks about, sorry, just lost the language, but the language you use and mastery. He talks about ownership and possession and mastery. And so thinking about land and things that we possess, not as possessions, but things that we own. And then thinking about the things that we own, but also our neighbors as something that we can master and lord over. And I think this starts to really, tap into the fact that I think this conversation is unique in the United States because of the history and legacy of chattel slavery, where we literally had legislation that started to disciple us into seeing our neighbors as possessions, as commodities, as things that ultimately we can engage with selectively for our own fiscal benefits. And that type of engagement, while most explicitly crystallized in chattel slavery, is not relegated to chattel slavery. When we think about the push and pull factor that really informs the immigration conversation on our southern border, there's been this constant way of seeing migrant work as exploitatable, and so it's a commodity. Folks are commodities, and so when we're in wartime and we are short of workers, we encourage people to come over, and as soon as people return from war and we say we no longer need them, then we say get out of here. And this push and pull kind of reality in which we see people as commodities. The same thing, would be true through the legislation of the 13th Amendment, where, people need to go and they need to pay their debt to society, but their debt is ultimately paid through their economic exploitation, to the extent that we still legally say that slavery in our nation is permissible because of a criminal offense. And so this legacy of seeing people as commodities is directly encased within this conversation. So that's a big level, but I'll bring it down on a very practical level and talk about even myself in this. I'm kind of in this season right now. As we talked about a little bit on this podcast. I've got a book coming out in August, and the whole barter of, hey, will you be on my book launch team? Will you help me get the word out about this? Like you approach folk in a way that doesn't fully feel natural. It doesn't always feel honoring of the relational confines that have been built, and particularly coming off of a year and a half of a pandemic where some of these folk you haven't seen and haven't really been immersed in their lives in the way that you traditionally have. These asks have felt really awkward at times. And I felt like the way in which this conversation is like pressing in a very everyday way for me in my life right now, that when you were framing the introduction, my mind just like immediately wandered there. So
right, as soon as you're thinking about all the people as a potential book buyer when you're an author, or Stephany, you ran for Congress and for Senate, and you're thinking of every person as a voter, like that people have a role to play in the success of your life as you want to see your own life. That's one of those moments where you start to say, boy, what other resources do I have? How is it that I can approach people with some honesty and integrity for them as a human being, right? Caring about another person, caring about yourself as human beings. I think of Jesus's teaching that from the Jewish tradition, that you love yourself the way you love God. So, your three calls are to love God, to love your neighbor, to love yourself and your enemy. So this idea that the way you love God is the way you love yourself, and the way you love your neighbor and enemy are also in the same way you love yourself. And you shouldn't think of yourself as a separate subject that you are trying to control or trying to utilize for something. But then, Dominique, as you bring up, because I've been an author too, right? And I've gone down that path, a lot of times. And I remember wrestling with the idea, like, okay, the ideas in my book are not what I'm selling. The ideas are, they are what I want to exchange with other human beings as human beings. What I'm selling you are those ideas contained in digital format or paper format, that the construct of the sentences and the editing and the formatting, and that's all the stuff that I'm selling. That's what's going to make it worth $12 or $22 or whatever it is. The ideas I want to be part of the free exchange that we have. I don't want to hold my ideas, to a financial model. So I think ultimately all that sort of ended up being a bunch of fahooey. I'm not sure anybody really sort of got that, but these are the ways I was trying to justify it myself, because I was really trying to wrestle with what is the thing that I offer to the world that's part of the human exchange, the human touch points, and what are the things that we can put a dollar amount on? And partly because I've spent a lot of my adult life being paid as a religious leader, boy, that also implicates, the practice of spirituality in a curious way. So I would try to think like, well, what I'm paid to do is to do this like organizing and the work side to kind of make all of it happen. But then when we have this real experience together that's spiritual, and that, I'm a pastor and you're part of a community, that's not what you're paying for. Like, that's not what your contributions go for. That's not how I earn my living. That's a real, true human experience, that I'm not, that we're just exchanging in the shared humanity and spiritual life that we have together. That's not something you buy and sell from a person. So I don't know. These are the places that I feel like it's really deep wrestling with, like, how do I live an integrated life where I know, I have mortgages to pay and things I want to buy and a job I have to have, but also I want something to be real that's not just about that kind of an exchange, or not. And I have
and
not
I think you aren't alone. You're not alone. I mean, the mental gymnastics that you just performed for us in terms of like writing a book and trying to sell ideas, but not ideas. It's so ingrained in a lot of us, and I want to say even biblically we see Jesus wrestling with it, right? You have the disciple talking about we got to pay taxes, and Jesus is like, go to the fish's mouth and get some for me and thee, right? We live in structured ways as again, as human beings organized to live in community, to live in society. There are structured ways in which we know that there are resources on the planet that are available to our use, that are necessary to our use, and how we begin to value them, how we begin to use them, who has access to what. I think these are the larger, like structural, bigger questions that we have to ask ourselves in relationship to righteousness, in relationship to justice, in relationship to love. But at the end of the day, yes, we are going to find ourselves in a place because of the kinds of societies that we live in, the moment in time that we live in, where we are asking that question and navigating those issues. The scripture tells us a workman is worthy of their hire, right? That even as spiritual leaders or human beings, that there is something inside of us that is of value, and as we share with others, it should be valued, right? It should not be taken for granted. It should not be abused. It should not be minimized in the sense. Now, that value doesn't have to be equated to a dollar amount, but it is of value. What Dominique brings to our conversation, what Doug brings to my life as a friend, is of value and must be honored in it, in a way that is respectful of the value that I have for it. And it doesn't always have to be, like I said, a financial means of exchange. But if I disrespect you, if I disrespect the nature of our relationship, that's a dishonoring of what you have inside of you to share and to give unto others, right? It's in part why I don't necessarily take a salary for the pastoral work that I do, because that's not how I value that work, and I don't want that work to be tainted in that particular way. But then there are some things that need to have a dollar amount to it. If I have to be in another state in order to do something, then either the plane has to get me there, the train, or the automobile. So there is a larger structure that we live in that doesn't have to limit or mitigate what is invaluable to the extent of our humanness, right? Like it's so necessary for us. That is the purpose of us being here as beings, as products of the Spirit, to share what we have with each other.
Yeah, and this is one of the struggles I know for people who are retiring. They reach retirement age, and there's a real crisis that many retired people feel, because it's no longer about do they need money or not. Like, some people have figured out their financial life after retirement. Like, good for them. But they retire and then they say, like, I don't know where I fit in society anymore. I don't know of how I'm useful. I don't know where my place is, because no one needs me to do the thing any longer. And that's when you start to realize you can even see yourself as a cog in a larger system. And that's what gives your life meaning and significance, and then people find other ways to find their meaning. And sometimes they just, go do stuff as a volunteer. Like, I'm just going to go volunteer places where I still have a reason and a rationale to exist. And that's one of the struggles with a consumeristic, possession-oriented and like duty-bound society, is that just even conceiving, are we someone who has value in the world, whether it's exchanged for dollars or not? It's one of the real deep spiritual questions, I think, that I'm sure exists in other societies. I don't know, because I've only been enculturated in the United States, so there's only one society that I know at a deep level. But that's the real, and we ingrain this into all of us, from a very young age. We start to send these messages that apparently we want. Like, we want these messages as human beings, at least some of us do, because they're so attractive and so sticky. And I think they don't always serve us or the people that we care about all that well.
It's one of those things where there's, it's the two sides of the coin. There's a very virtuous, noble, honoring element to wanting to contribute, wanting to be a positive force and source for change, and really helping to model what you believe to be true in the world. And so, but then there's this other element in which that need for affirmation, that need to be sought after and desired, can really be rooted in a lack of love for oneself, a lack of one's connectivity and feeling honored and affirmed by God, and a lack of wanting to do some of the internal work to help you be your most healthy, centered self. And so I think when there is this need to constantly be in the limelight, on the platform, in the front of the crowd, or leading something, I think you have to have the humility and the transparency to have people in your life who can speak into your life and say, hey, while all this is good, there might also be a shadow side to this. There might be also something else that's fueling this. And I think the other element of it is you can move into these places and spaces of influence or even service, all from the right intentions in a centered place. But once you get there, you can also lose yourself in those places and spaces if you aren't cultivating space for centering yourself and having voices of accountability, and aren't willing to be transparent enough to be honest with your inner circle about what's really going on or fueling stuff. But I think that's the other piece in which I think some of what you were talking about, Doug, the rhythms of life, to build off of what Stephany was saying, can become dishonoring to community. I think consumption and the way we think about consumption and production can drive us to be on this rat race to the point that we don't even know how to be present with people anymore. And we're like calculating, how do we fit relationships that are vital into our schedule, because our schedule is so full of trying to be productive. And I think that becomes a real danger. And I think part of the way that we see this manifest itself with so many folks who get platforms who ultimately end up breaking relationships and being abusive and toxic in how they engage, because the relationships are no longer a core part of the foundation of their life, but they become these commodities. They become these things that they have to negotiate into their schedule around the other things that are truly the priorities. And so I think there has to be ways in which we take more seriously. And, I was somebody who, and I always struggle, so I'll just be confessional in this. Like, I struggle with Sabbath keeping. I think Sabbath keeping is very important. I think it is something that can help ground us and root us. But I do struggle with broader conversations around Sabbath keeping, because I feel like they can tend towards legalism, and I don't think that that's healthy either. And I think, when I think about Sabbath keeping, I think about it on multiple levels, partially because I'm very informed by the work of Walter Brueggemann, and really talking about like Sabbath keeping as a direct intentional breaking from this kind of consumptive patterns that we're talking about. But I also think about Sabbath keeping as something that should draw us further into community. So it's not just the breaking from this consumptive pattern, but it's also something that draws me closer to and binds me in a deeper way to others. And so I think, I guess I struggle with the, it has to be the same day, look the same way, like some of that kind of stuff that comes with the conversation of it. But I do think that Sabbath is a spiritual practice that is supposed to be woven into the Christian life to help counteract some of these temptations that we're talking about today.
It's so funny that this is our conversation, because I was literally just having this discussion this past week when someone asked me, do you work? And I was like, do I have a mortgage? I absolutely work, but because my labor looks very different, especially in this remote season that we have been in due to the pandemic, my work looks different, that it is not being like glued to a computer, glued to a desk from 9 o'clock in the morning to 6 in the evening with an hour break. They, for them, it's just like, what is really happening or what have you. And in my response to them, it was, is that really the question that we want to ask? Because who wakes up in the morning, or whose goal in life is to get up and just be like, oh, I labor all day, every day for 6 days a week, like that, like nobody says when I grow up, I want to be a laborer, like I just want to give my labor consistently to someone else and not have the flexibility of my time, not be able to enjoy what my purpose and my walk in life, like this is work, right? Like our podcast is work, whether or not there's a paycheck associated with it, is completely not the point, right?
Yeah.
but the way in which we give of ourselves into our purpose and into the world, into the people and the lives around us, I think is so important. And in this place that we call the United States, we have such a fascination and obsession that with productivity, right? That it's almost addictive and toxic, right? That we are in social media, we are online telling each other how tired we are because, we're trying to be super women and super men. And I saw a meme the other day that said, sis, there's no gold star for wearing yourself into the ground, like for real. But we're so consumed with this idea of what productivity looks like and what labor looks like. I'm like, why don't we have 2-hour siestas like the rest of the world, and have that break, have that break that Dominique was talking about, that ability to go home and to lunch and to be with family, right? I lived in Martinique for a summer in grad school, and I was like, this is so strange. Like the entire community shuts down in the middle of the day so people could be together and to have like lunch and siesta together. And when I found out that was not just in the Caribbean, but like almost, so many populations and societies around the world were doing that, that they had mandatory vacation, that it was mandated by law to take vacation. And I was just like, what are we doing in the United States? And what is this almost, again, this religion to productivity. Like, what does that mean for us?
Yeah, that is so right, because it's this. I mean, you think about even the word productivity is, it's the word product, right? How do you produce a thing? And this idea that we want our lives to even have meaning. Like, I know there's a lot of desire for people to live a purposeful, meaningful life, and there's a whole industry built around that idea, right? But that's got its own sort of side to this, which says that life has to really have outcome. It needs to have purpose and meaning, which is a much, I mean, that's a better way to drive it than to say that you're just going to work endlessly. But it's also kind of just a way to wrap working endlessly up into something more meaningful. Partly because we do this work with Vote Common Good, and I don't know why this is, but we've attracted people who are very interested in the outcomes that we talk about at Vote Common Good, right? They want voting to change, they want the political system to change. We work with religious people to try to give them an off-ramp from republicanism if they're looking for that. And so it's attracted a whole lot of people who don't have to have standard employment any longer, right? So, it's tempting when you're the executive director of a nonprofit organization to see every person you meet as a potential donor or potential volunteer, right? And that's a spiritual practice I have to engage in to not do that. But anyway, it's been a lot of people who see themselves like saying, hey, I have time in my life for whatever reason. I don't have to work the way I did before. I'm trying to find places to invest, and they're not meaning searching, right? They're not sort of scrolling through trying to find meaning in their life. They know what they want to do. And it's difficult as someone who can feel that life doesn't, that I'm trying to put something together, we're trying to make something happen, to not see all these people as if I'm inside of a human Home Depot and all of these people are an item that I could construct together. And maybe that's just a certain personality that I have, and maybe others have it too, that like trying not to see human resources. Like when I first was, becoming an adult and heard that companies had a human resources department and HR department, that word that like, oh, there's natural resources and then there's human resources, very Matrix-like, right? Like not seeing people as a resource that I can deploy for a certain purpose and outcome. That's a really hard space to find ourselves in. It's a hard space to live in if you're the kind of person who might tend toward that. And so I kind of envy the people who don't. That's part of the reason I've really liked hanging around artists and musicians and poets. Like they might have their own demons running in their heads about like, what do I do with all the feelings, with all the words, and how do I express and how do I get this out? But they're not looking at the world the way I do. Like, what's a set of assets and resources that I could deploy to make a thing happen? That has its own, and I think a lot of people in the activist spaces and the spiritual activist spaces, boy, some of us, that's a real tendency, right? To sort of scan the crowd and look over anyone that we think is not going to be useful for us. Like we're a great farmer at the co-op at a farmer's market, sort of, quickly scanning to find the great fruit that they're gonna buy as a chef. Like that, I don't know. Do you know what I'm getting at? This kind of idea that we could just.
I think about, so I try to be somebody who tries to be sober in how we talk about things, because I think the natural tendency, at least that I see in a lot of folks, is to talk about stuff when it comes to critique in a way that's out there, but doesn't implicate ourselves. And so like, when I think about like the way in which this manifests in circles that I am in or in my own life, I think about the way that this translates for the church is productivity is translated into fruitfulness. And so like you can get so obsessed with fruitfulness and like, is this ministry producing fruit? How is my life producing fruit? Am I seeing fruit? That basically what we're talking about is productivity. We just have Christian language for it.
Right.
And I think we can be on this rat race in the same way, that is just as disconnected, even though it's done in the name of God, but just as disconnected and fracturing of ourselves from the centered, holistic, fully engaged self that God wants us to be. And I think when we think about it in activist spaces, I think because of so much activism, folks don't know how, we're not taught to pace ourselves in the activism that we do. And we're also, particularly from a Christian perspective, we don't really disciple folks in a way that really initiates or animates this kind of this understanding for the need for transformation and change in the world, but in a way that doesn't lead to saviorism. And so, like, what ultimately ends up happening a lot of times is folk who are fresh and new and like gung-ho about activism, they go all out and then they get burnt out. And then so these folk who have played these critical roles in the movements that we're trying to help lead or foster or shape, they become integral parts of what we're doing. But when they get burnt out, we need somebody else or other people to step into those places and spaces. And that's when we start to think about people in that commodity way, because like we haven't created sustainable ways of understanding social change that allow people to engage, but to engage in a measured way that is sustainable, that is healthy, that is holistic, and that doesn't manifest itself in saviorism. And so I think these are like some of the ways I think we need to take a critical lens to the ways in which we're doing formation and movement work, and to see like how does this conversation implicate us too, as opposed to just pointing the finger outward. And so those are some of the thoughts that were coming up and rising up in me as you were talking, Doug.
Yeah, we have so much work to do as a community. And just again, back to some of the original comments of how do we honor who we are, what we have to offer that isn't necessarily just trapped in this economy of capitalism and consumerism. And it's such a hard thing, especially for the church. I know that there are so many people who are not actively engaged in church because they see the church as nothing more than capitalist industry right now. And to Dominique's earlier point, it's such a double-edged sword or two-sided coin, that what started off as outreach, what started off as, just ministry in community is now like a whole singles vacation getaway, situation, or the cafe at the mega space is now mini Starbucks, or, and what does that do to the work of the Spirit? And again, for some people, that fruitfulness is measured by how many people you can get in the door. And if you have to entertain them as if they were in a concert with flashing lights, Jay-Z and Rihanna singing or performing, then let's get the theater lights and we're gonna do all of the things or what have you. And does that impact the work of the Spirit? On one hand, it's easy to just say yes. It just becomes, performative. On the other hand, if you don't get people in space and in the door, then what, right? If you don't, how do you get to build relationship with people? So it's such a complex place that I think the church itself needs to be wrestling with a whole lot more than what we actually do.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways we got a comment from one of our listeners, and I think it's interesting because this is the flip side of the coin of the trope that I constantly hear when people kind of are rubbed the wrong way by some of the work that I do. You hear this stuff around the deconstruction of the family and why that's so important. But I think Stephany Fox raises something important. She says, our children are in daycares all day being raised by people our children don't even know, all so we can go to work. Our children are now killing their peers. It's so insane. And I think in a way, this speaks to the deconstruction of the family in a different way. That is molded and informed and shaped by this conversation that we're having, where we really do offer ourselves and our lives, and to an extent our family sometimes, on the altar of consumption by prioritizing it above all else, to the point that we can't even be present with our families, be engaged in our children's lives, and we have no real moral or ethical conflict around the fact that our kids are being raised completely separated from us because our priorities are the rat race. And so I think that's a really critical element to this when we talk about some of the dysfunction we do see in society, and this conversation around the prioritization or the deconstruction of the family. I think we've historically let that conversation just go one way, and we haven't really critically examined the other side of the coin and how that manifests itself within our consumer society.
Well, I think this is the kind of stuff that is what our spirituality, and for all of us, our Christianity is supposed to help us find a way to navigate, right? Like what is the other way that you could look at your life and see that there's another path you could live. And so many of these paths they're internal narratives. They're the mental landscapes that we live in, right? They're how we view the world. And those are the adjustments that often we don't know how to even change. That perception is so powerful, and we don't often we don't often have the ability to see and to perceive that there's another way of going and living and being. And some of this is really at the forefront of people because it feels like COVID pandemic, the implications of it are ending. This disease will likely be around in our society for a long time, but the things that we did to respond to it are timing out. And so people are now reevaluating, well, am I going back to those same patterns that I had before? Do I not want to? How do I see myself going forward? How do I want to spend my time? The things, Dominique, you brought up, that Sabbath in the Jewish tradition and Christian traditions built into a weekly rhythm, right? You sort of pause every 6 days and give yourself a 24-hour period to recenter and reevaluate and not just be pushed along by the rolling river. We're in one of those moments, and I hope that people have found this conversation to be helpful. I certainly have. I mean, because these aren't just issues that have only come up for us, right? Jesus wouldn't have taught on them. Spiritual leaders before Jesus wouldn't have taught on them. Spiritual leaders after Jesus in other parts of the world wouldn't have taught on these issues if we thought they were just created by the conditions of 21st century America. These are human struggles of which the conditions of 21st century America provide us a unique vantage point on. But they're part of the what it means to grow as a human being and to become the kind of person and the kind of communities that we really want. And they do require some level of engagement and intentionality. And they're not easy. If they were easy, we would have just moved on with them, right? And people would just, I don't know, we wouldn't be, we wouldn't have all the responses that we have to issues like this.
And I want to make a quick connection back to last week's conversation, though, because I think one of the ways in which U.S. capitalism does kind of shift the conversation in some elements is, again, the way in which we think about work as commodity. And so certain work is so fiscally valued, so much so than other work, to the point that when I was just talking about some folks not being able to be with their kids, well, within our structure, when there's not a livable wage paid for certain kinds of work, and people have to have 2 and 3 jobs to be able to make ends meet, and therefore they're forced out of being able to be kind of the parental, play the parental role that they would otherwise desire to, then we also have to look at how consumption also speaks into that, and how we, as folks who are trying to advocate for the common good, have to really take seriously what does it mean that work is not valued in a way that a person can work 1 full-time job and sustain a family. And so I think those are the other side of what we're talking about as well.
Yeah. Well, and I know we're not going to talk about daycare here. We should at some point. There's also this weird thing that some daycare worker, people who have their kids in daycare, don't want daycare workers making more money than they make. Right? There's this strange thing where people are like, well, if they make more money than I do, then why would I put my kid in the daycare? And so there's this strange little thing that sort of goes on in the hierarchy of that are daycare workers and childcare workers and care workers of the sick and the elderly are often not compensated anywhere close to what we would call reasonable, livable wages, and the people who need to take services from them struggle with how much they're paid. Like we have a strange caste system in our world, in our society, that I think is just worth noting at some point. All these essential workers that we name are also oftentimes very underpaid people that find themselves struggling with the level of pay that they receive.
And I want to answer Mike's question that was raised in the comments. What are your ideas on communal living as opposed to outright capitalism, productivity, profit motivations that predominate today? The early Christians seem to have geared more toward communal living. Communal life would seem to benefit families and children. I want to also say that a lot of what we are seeing goes back again to some of our very early comments in this and other podcasts, that this is a product, like what we are seeing in our society is very much a product of an intersectional, interconnected construct of Western ideology that is rooted in race, that is rooted in class and gendered ideas that are very unique to the modern again constructs of what white supremacist ideology is. I know for some people we only got like 4 minutes left. We're not going to get to all of that, but the idea of not being in intergenerational family constructs, the notion of a nuclear family that is just mom, dad, children, is so Western white centered. That is not the way in which most of the world prior to the age of exploration constructed itself. The idea that elders would be cast out of community into these nursing homes or assisted living facilities or whatever is so far from what many indigenous communities know to be in terms of community, right? So a lot of what we are experiencing is very unique to the way in which this society has been constructed. And not just this society, but Western society has been constructed in the modern era. And again, I know we only have like 3 minutes left to even, think about these things. But go on throughout your week and on your Sabbath and think these
And
things
think about
through.
them. That's right. That's right. You think about them on your own time. We can't be with you for the whole time. Hey, thank you, Stephany. Thank you, Dominique. I love our Wednesdays. Really appreciate it. And to all of you who listen, thank you for being part of it as well. Tomorrow, I recorded an interview with Marianne Buddy. She's the bishop of the Episcopal Church, Washington, D.C. diocese, which includes the National Cathedral. One of her churches is the St. John's Church at Lafayette Square, which Donald Trump chose to use as a backdrop for holding the Bible up to give himself moral and religious authority for his authoritarianism. So I just did an interview with her that we're going to show tomorrow. So if you follow us on Thursdays, we talk about different issues and topics. And it's just a fabulous conversation from Bishop Marianne Buddy. And so that's going to be our conversation tomorrow. And Friday, we talk science and economics and all the rest. Lots of things going on. Please pay attention to the work we're doing around immigration, both on the policy front and trying to raise awareness around what life is like in the borderland regions. We're going to be doing a bike tour from San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida, September 10th to November 14th. And it's a chance for you as an individual, for people as leaders, for organizations to get involved in this for a day, for a week, for a month, for 65 days if you want to do the whole thing. Organizations are putting teams together on their ride to put a relay team together to ride from San Diego to St. Augustine, Florida, to narrate the story of the need for common good immigration and border practices. So lots of things happening in our world, and in and through the periods of having to vote or not. There's a lot of ways that we construct our world that are in addition to the people that we elect and represent, and we want to be fully engaged in all those areas. So thank you, Dominique. Thank you, Stephany. Thank you, Dan. And we'll talk with you all again next week.